Hello, fellow crime detectives. Welcome to this week's episode of On the Case with me, Detective Alex Cardinale. I hope you guys and gals are doing great and are ready for an exciting week. Today, I am going to break down a crime that definitely shocked New York and definitely shocked America. This crime took place in March of 2009, and it is still talked about today, mainly because it was a crime that involved a 47-year-old man that posted an ad on Craigslist looking for sex, and it was responded to by a 16-year-old boy. And many people thought that the 47-year-old man was taking advantage of a 16-year-old boy, and the man could have been labeled as a pedophile. But nonetheless, the man was viciously murdered by the 16-year-old boy. And since it was a horrific murder, the 16-year-old boy did get sentenced and he is serving life in prison. Now, I am of the belief that the victim in this case could have had sexual desires that could have labeled him as a sexual deviant or a pedophile, but did he deserve to be murdered for it? No. But we're going to talk about the horrific tragedy that happened because of his actions and his death. So today I'm going to break down everything you need to know about this case. I'm going to share my thoughts, and then I've got a couple of topics towards the end of the show that are going to deal with the situation of casual encounters online, online dating, and all of that good stuff. So you're going to enjoy this episode of On the Case with Alex Cardinale. And as always, I encourage you to leave your thoughts on this crime in the comments of today's video. So let's get started. So this week's crime case took place outside of a Brooklyn, New York apartment belonging to 47-year-old George Weber. George Weber was found stabbed to death in his home on March 20th, 2009. Now, Mr. George Weber had over 50 stab wounds. So he was stabbed over 50 times in a very, very sadistic fashion. He was killed by 50 stab wounds. So this crime started by a Craigslist ad. So George had went to Craigslist. He went to the Men Seeking Men casual encounter part of Craigslist looking for gay sex. He had put an ad out that he wanted to be smothered, and he would pay the person that was doing the smothering and the gay sex $60. And this is where he met his maker, and this is where he got killed. So let's start talking about this horrific crime right now. So here is what to know about this murder case. So we're going to start by learning about the victim. So the victim is 47-year-old American radio personality George Weber. And this is what George Weber looked like in real life. George Weber was very popular. He was a favorite of many people in New York, specifically Brooklyn, New York. A lot of people listened to him on the Brooklyn, New York radio station, and he was followed by a lot of people in the New York area. And his murder is one of the most talked about murders in New York City. It's still talked about today. Like I said, America is divided over this crime. There are some people that are on the fence. Some people think his actions of luring minors considers him to be a pedophile, but then there are people that feel bad that he was murdered. Even if he was into more younger people, Still, he shouldn't have been murdered for his actions, but it is to be expected when you're dealing with people that aren't developed in the brain, like people under 18. They don't realize their actions, so it was to be expected. But that is what George Weber looked like. So now, George Weber, he was born on March 23rd, 1961, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as I said, he was an American radio personality on the ABC radio network doing hourly news updates. For several years, he was on the WABC 77 morning show with Curtis Sliwa and Ron Kuby in New York City. He did periodic news updates throughout the morning, as well as joining in conversation with the host about those news stories. He was found stabbed to death in his home on March 20th, 2009, at the age of 47 years old. Now, as a former tobacco user, he has been featured in radio advertisements for kickthehabitnow.com. That just goes to show you how popular George Weber was. George had a website. On his website, he posted personal blogs. And his personal blogs were stories and investigations that were based around experiences in his personal and private life. He often reported about his neighborhood in New York, and his two dogs were featured in some of his stories. The last story on his website was published on the same day he died, which was March 20th, 2009, and it described an outbreak of bed bugs around his Carroll Gardens neighborhood. Here is one of his last postings on his website. Now, this last posting is regarding the passing of one of his beloved puppies. Now, I am a dog owner. I'm an owner of a beloved beagle, and if I lost my dog, I would be distraught just like Mr. Weber was. But here is from his website. It's an extract from a letter to dog Noodles after the death of his other dog, Romer. Don't bite me, Noodles, if I hug you a little more these days, or if I squeeze you too tight. That's how humans show how much we love each other and comfort each other in times of grief. And someday when you get old and frail like Romer, I promise I'll be by your side in the autumn of your life. You won't be as playful or agile, but you'll be wiser in your elder years. You'll be able to reflect on all the things you learned, all the friends you made, and most of all, little buddy, you will continue to be my best friend well after you take your last nap. I love you, Daddy. So that's an example of what he would post on his website. And I have no idea whether or not his website is still active today. Now, around March 15th, 2009, so 5 days before he was murdered, George had posted an ad on Craigslist, and he went under the casual encounters section of Craigslist, men seeking men section, and he was looking for sex. That is where he met his killer. Now, it has been suggested that George was gay, or at the very least bisexual, as he had gay sex on multiple occasions. And it's been reported that some of his partners were under the age of 18, and some were about 18, 19, 20, 21. So whether or not he is a pedophile is too late to determine that, because he is dead now. But George Weber, he had a sexual fetish for being smothered to the point of where he was close to passing out. That is disgusting, in my personal opinion. I don't know what's erotic about that. I could not imagine being smothered and finding that erotic or anything like that. That would be absolutely disgusting, in my personal opinion, but that's beyond our topic today. Our topic is about the murder of George Weber. So, George Weber had posted an ad offering money for sexual service and he wanted to be smothered. And that is where 16-year-old John Katheis responded. So now we know about the victim. Let's learn about the suspect and the perpetrator of this murder, 16-year-old John Katheis. Now, John Kattis was no angel himself. He was no perfect teenage boy. He had plenty of demons and a lot of issues. And if George Weber had done some research on this boy, he could still be alive today. Because if George had seen his MySpace and his other social media pages from 2009, he would know that John Katheis was a very sick, twisted individual. And John had a love for dangerous weapons like knives. Take a look at this picture right here. This is the murderer. This is 16-year-old John Katheis posing with a knife. And there is a caption under this picture on his now defunct MySpace page. And I'm going to tell you about that caption in just a second. This is John Kattis being arrested for the murder of George Weber. He is being arrested by fellow detectives. So let's learn about the suspect, John Kattis, right now. So John was an American student who was convicted in the 2011, John Kattis was an American student who was convicted in 2011 of murdering George Weber, a popular radio reporter, in March 2009. Because John met Weber through Craigslist, a popular classified advertising website, the media dubbed him a Craigslist killer, which is a generic term for murderers who find victims by placing or responding to ads in Craigslist. John Kattis was a Satanist and a sadomasochist. So that goes to show you the kind of character John was. He believes in Satan and he was a sadomasochist. Disgusting. Now, John had threatening messages on his MySpace account. His caption under this picture was, "If you disrespect me, then I will fucking break your neck." That, if I saw that and I was George Weber, I would leave this man alone. Very, very threatening. So, on his website, John Kattis called himself an extremist, an anarchist, a sadomasochist, and said he enjoyed long conversations, drinking, bike riding, and hanging out. The teen also listed more reckless hobbies such as roof hopping, hanging off trains, and violent video games. "I am a very easy person to talk to," he wrote. "I'm always looking for a big thrill." The radio station became worried and nervous after George Weber did not show up for any of his shifts. And that led people thinking something is wrong. Why is George Weber not here? So now that we know about the suspect, John Kattis, and the victim, George Weber, let's talk about the actual crime. The crime is very, very devastating. So here is the crime. The crime happened on March 20th, 2009. So on March 20th, 2009, John Katheis responds to an ad that George Weber posted, and George and John exchanged texts and photos, and they agreed to meet at George's house. They would have had the rough sex, and George would pay John $60 in exchange. John and George had a few drinks, and then they went to the bedroom to have sex, where it was agreed that John would smother George. Police suspected it was during this time that John had realized he no longer wanted to participate in anything sexual, maybe because John decided he was not a homo. But George was persistent about going through with it, or he would not pay John the $60. So reluctantly, John tied George up. George had his hands and feet bound, and John took George's pants and underwear down. John pretended to smother George in his sexual desires for a few minutes before pulling out a knife and starting the assault. John first stabbed George in the neck 8 times and then proceeded to stab him over 50 times. And this is why detectives felt this was more of a hate crime rather than a crime that was done out of anger. I mean, if you were angry, you would have said, fuck you, George. I don't care what your $60. I'm leaving. But again, at 16 years old, you don't have the capacity to think about what you're doing right or wrong. And again, it was wrong for George to do this to a 16-year-old, considering it is kind of pedophiliac. But we do have to remember that George was stabbed 8 times in the neck, and then he was stabbed 50 more times. So this shows an act of rage, an act of violence. It is very sadistic. It is unthinkable. Anyway, after killing George, John ransacked the bedroom, stole George's money and other belongings, washed himself up, and left. But Mr. John made one fatal mistake. During his knife attack, he cut himself on the hand. So when you're constantly pushing a knife up and down, you're going to slip and you're probably going to cut yourself. That's what happens in a lot of these stabbing murderers. Or that's what happens to a lot of these stabbing murderers. They stab so much and blood's all over their hands that the knife gets slippery and you end up cutting yourself. And that ends up that ends up doing yourself in, because you're going to go to the hospital. The hospital is going to be curious as how you got a wound so big and why it's bled so much. But in reality, all that other blood is from your victim, and the hospital reports you to the police, and that's how you get found out. And that is what happened to Mr. John Katheis, the 16-year-old. He went to the hospital to treat the wound. The hospital staff noticed how big the wound was, and they noticed something wasn't right. So the hospital asked him personally what happened, and he told them he had cut himself open with a bottle. The hospital doctor, whoever was in charge, found that very suspicious, and they called the police. The police leader came out to the hospital and investigated Mr. John Katheis, but they did not see anything suspicious about his actions, and they had no way of knowing he was the actual murderer of Mr. George Weber. So after he killed George, took all his belongings, ransacked his apartment, he washed himself, but he also left the water running, which is another mistake he made. Anyway, no one heard from George Weber for a couple of days, and a co-worker became concerned when he did not show up for work on a Saturday morning, which is very unlike George Weber. So police were dispatched to Weber's apartment on Sunday morning at 12:30 a.m., but they noticed nothing amiss and then left. Again, the co-worker called again at 8:30 a.m. Cops returned to the building, where a neighbor said he had heard water running in the newsman apartment all night long. Police entered the apartment and discovered George Weber's body with his hands and feet bound. Weber had been stabbed more than 50 times in the neck, chest, and arms, and his guest bedroom had been ransacked. The water was still running in the apartment's bathtub and kitchen sink, and investigators believe Weber's killer used the water to clean himself after the murder. Authorities said there was no sign of forced entry. On March 25th, police arrested 16-year-old student John Katheis of East Elmhurst, Queens, New York for the murder. He was lured to a rendezvous with detectives by his father, who promised to give him $300, and was arrested without incident. Kattis confessed to the crime when apprehended, also claiming to be a Satanist and a sadomasochist. Kattis told police that he and Weber had met through a personal ad Weber had posted on Craigslist for rough sex, but he stabbed Weber in self-defense after Weber tried to stab him. This led to the media referring to Kattis as a Craigslist killer. However, in court, it was determined that John Kattis' defense was a lie. There was no indication that George Weber tried to stab him at all. And jurors decided this was a hate crime. And although I do really think that George was in the wrong for luring a minor, but he's dead, so there's no case of pedophilia there. Anyway, John Kattis was charged as an adult for the murder of George Weber, with the second-degree murder charge and a criminal possession of a weapon, and pleaded not guilty despite his confession. John Kattis' lawyer claimed there was an ongoing relationship between Weber and Kattis, but the text messages and photos from the Craigslist ad proved otherwise. Following a mistrial, Kattis was convicted in 2011 at a retrial, and he's sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. So John Katheis is spending the rest of his life in prison if he ever makes it out. Author David McConnell, in his book American Honor Killings, Desire and Rage Among Men, explored the John Katheis case as a main example of lethal hate crimes on homosexual men, where the perpetrators exhibited some degree of homosexuality themselves. And I have to agree with the author of that book. I mean, if you're not gay, why would you respond to an ad on a men seeking men casual encounter section of Craigslist? I mean, if you're not gay, why would you be on a men seeking men casual encounter section of Craigslist in the first place? So again, this crime shook America, because you've got people saying, oh, George was a pedophile. Then you've got people saying that George was taking advantage of a 16-year-old. But if John had no intentions of having sex with George, why would he have gone through the Craigslist ad and reached out to George? Maybe John had the intention of going there to kill and steal the money, but who knows? Nonetheless, this was a very horrific, erotic murder, and hopefully it never happens again. I'm sure it probably will, but it will be rare for it to happen on Craigslist, because now Craigslist removed their casual encounter section on their classified website. So my thoughts on this crime. It is a very, very difficult crime to share my thoughts on, because on one hand, I do agree with some of America that George was not really much of a victim, considering he was taking part in a crime itself, pedophilia. Considering that at the time John was 16 years old and he wanted John to do sexual acts, that means that George died performing a crime, which is sex with a minor. On the other hand, still, it's still not okay to say that even though George was committing a crime, he deserved to be murdered for it. I mean, stabbed 50 times, stabbed 8 times in the neck. So by the ninth knife wound, he was already dead. So there was no reason to stab him 50 times. What I think about this case is that a sick man, a mentally sick George Weber, or a sexual deviant George Weber, met his match in a man or a young teenage boy that believed in Satan, had evil thoughts, was an atheist, and an overall bad person who had no shame in murdering people. Well, he met someone of his dreams, and that person ended up killing him and taking his life. Look, I have no problem with older guys liking younger folks, like people in their 20s. But it's very dangerous when you're going on online dating sites looking for people 18 and younger. Why? Well, you can get arrested. That's obviously one of the biggest red flags. People will think you're a pedophile and your reputation will go out there. But there are some young, devious, Satanist teenagers out there that are cult followers. And a good example would be John Katheis, who will take advantage of your sexual desire if you promise them money. Well, that's an invitation for them to come over to your house, take advantage of you, steal your money, and kill you. So it's a very, very dangerous world, and it's one that I recommend everyone to stay away from. Don't ever fall for young teenagers because it shows that you could be a pedophile and they could be dangerous to you and ruin your reputation in more ways than one. I do have to say it's a shame that George lost his life. I can never condone anyone being murdered for any action, but a very, very sad, sad case. So my thoughts and prayers are with the Weber family. And I know this is probably a really difficult case for them. I can imagine what it's like to watch the news about your son or your father or whoever George Weber was to them. And then they have to hear the media talk about him maybe being a pedophile or being attracted to teenage boys. That must have been difficult. And whether or not he's gay or bisexual really doesn't matter. It's his decision in who he wanted to have sex with. He was fine having sex with the 18 to 20-year-olds, but the moment he lowered his guard and he went down to under 18 is when he did the wrong. And had he not done that, he may still be alive today. But unfortunately, he was murdered. Let me get a drink real quick and then we'll finish this show. All right. So I have a couple of topics that I want to talk about, and they mainly are centered around casual encounters online. What is a casual encounter? Well, it could be when you meet somebody for sex, when you meet somebody for friendship. Basically, it's when you meet someone spontaneously for an action. It could be going out to eat. It could be a hand job or a blow job or anything like that. So let's talk about it. So here are my tips for using online classifieds for dating. There are plenty of websites out there that you could use. My first tip is to research the person you're talking to. Ask for a full name and go on every social media site and look up that full name and find out information on that person. Now, if they're a true individual and they're an honest person, you'll find profiles on social media. Now, if they're very shady and they only give you a certain name, then be very wary and maybe consider not doing anything with that person. My next advice would be to trust your gut. If you think someone is acting suspicious, if you think someone is bad and they have bad intentions, always trust your gut. Don't ever say, oh, maybe he's a good person. Maybe I'm wrong for thinking bad. Always trust your gut because your brain knows more than you do. And never let anyone suspicious either ride with you in your car alone or be in your house alone. If you think someone is a bad egg, have somebody with you just in case that person tries to act up. And next, we're going to talk about red flags on dating sites. Some things you should be aware of. An incredibly vague or incomplete profile, a profile filled with threats, pictures of guns or knives, just like John Katheis, someone that sends sexually explicit messages right away. That means they want to have sex or they want something in return. Someone that demands money or other things. It may not always be in a threatening manner. They may play victim. They may say that they're homeless or something like that to get money from you. So always be aware of those things. Those are red flags on dating sites. Now, here's what to do if you suspect someone is up to no good. Block them immediately. Get rid of contact with them. Do not talk to them ever again. Report them. Report them to whatever dating site you're using or whatever dating app you're using. This will allow the dating app to look into them and take them off their platform. And if they have threatened you in any way, call 911 if you feel your life is in danger, because then they'll look up their IP address and they'll keep you safe from this wacko. All right. And that is this week's crime case. I hope you guys enjoyed this crime. Like I said, please leave your thoughts on this crime in the comments. And hopefully you guys enjoyed today's episode of On the Case with Alex Cardinale. On the next crime case, next Monday night, I am going to talk about the Russian mail-order bride killer known as Indel King. This crime happened about 20 years ago, but it did shake America because it made us think about mail-order brides and how many of them are murdered. And Indel King is a perfect example of somebody that took advantage of not only one mail-order bride, one was lucky to get away, but he ended up killing Anastasia King. So next Monday night, 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific, right here on my YouTube channel, the legendary Alex Cardinale, I will talk about the Russian mail-order bride killer, Indel King. And that will be the final On the Case with Alex Cardinale for 2 weeks, because following Monday, March 24th, on Monday, April 4th, I'm going to do a WrestleMania recap. And then after April 4th, On the Case will be right back. So it's only a 1-week hiatus. All right, guys and gals, I want to thank you for watching this episode of On the Case with Alex Cardinale. If you enjoyed today's episode, please punch that like button and hit that like button. I appreciate all the likes that I get. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, the legendary Alex Cardinale. Stay safe, everybody. And I, Detective Alex Cardinale, will see you next Monday. Peace out, everybody. And stay safe.
Saturday, April 16, 2022, the Easter Bunny Alex Cardinale gets released. Come celebrate Easter 2022 with Easter Bunny Alex. The Easter Bunny is going to host the very first Easter 2022 bash. What will Chef Alex cook and bake? Will Aqua Alex make an appearance? What will the Easter Bunny have in store? Find out on Saturday, April 16, 2022 at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on the legendary Alex Cardinale YouTube channel. Happy Easter! Go get your chocolate Easter bunnies and candy now before it's too late.